your mouth and get your black ass on the ground before I put a bullet in your head. I said down, now!
The officer screamed it. And in the same breath, he swept his arm forward and hurled the man's leather messenger bag across the pavement, sending court documents scattering into the freezing wind.
Officer, I am a citizen waiting for the 914 bus. Am I under arrest?
You don't get to ask questions. Stay right there. One wrong move and you're done. You don't talk to me, boy! A piece of trash like you doesn't belong in this neighborhood!
The officer's face twisted with fury. He drove forward in a single violent burst and slammed the man's spine against the concrete wall of the bus shelter. He jabbed a finger into the man's face, spit flying, and he let out a cruel, mocking laugh. Then, with a sudden aggressive jerk, he wrenched the man's arms back and ratcheted the cold steel cuffs down, so tight the metal cut into the skin, until blood welled up around both wrists. 3 people stood within 15 steps of that shelter. They watched a calm, compliant man be treated like an animal, and not one of them turned around. And with one
Stop
final,
resisting! Get on the ground!
vicious shove,
Get off me!
the officer threw his whole weight forward and sent the handcuffed man crashing face first onto the frozen, gravel-strewn concrete. As the man lay there against the ice, the officer leaned down and spat on his cracked transit card, lying where it had fallen from the bag.
Look at you, just another nameless piece of garbage bleeding out on my street where you belong.
But this arrogant officer had just made the single most catastrophic mistake of his life, because he had no idea that the man he was grinding into the frozen ground was one of the most feared federal prosecutors in the state, the man who ran the Civil Rights Division for the entire district. And in less than 90 days, a single metadata audit would expose this assault, end his career, and dismantle his entire precinct. Welcome back to the channel, where we bring you the most intense stories of accountability and justice. If you want to support the work we do here, tell us in the comments exactly what city you are watching from today. Now let's find out how one arrogant officer's 3-second decision took his entire life apart, piece by piece. To understand how far this man fell, you first have to understand how high he stood. His name was Desmond Elias Ward, and he dealt in the currency of control. At 44, he was the Deputy Chief of the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Section at the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District. He had spent that particular Tuesday methodically dismantling a county commissioner who had sold 6 years of municipal contracts out the back door of his own office. Ward's suit was pressed to a razor's edge. His questions arrived in a flat, unhurried voice that left a witness nowhere to hide. When Ward spoke in a courtroom, federal agents stopped and wrote it down. When he frowned at a defense lawyer, plea offers got reconsidered before lunch. He was a man insulated by the immense, crushing weight of the federal government, but the federal government could not fix a dead alternator. At 7:52 that evening, 3 levels down in the concrete belly of the federal courthouse parking garage, Desmond turned the key of his ordinarily reliable sedan and was answered by nothing but the rapid, useless clicking of a battery that had quietly given up somewhere between the morning and the verdict. He sat there for a moment, forehead resting against the cold leather of the wheel. The day had hollowed him out. Roadside assistants quoted him 90 minutes. And he was not going to sit alone in a parking garage for 90 minutes. So he did what tens of thousands of exhausted people in that city did every single night. He decided to take the train 2 stops and catch the 9 bus the rest of the way home. Before he left the office, Desmond took off his armor, the tailored charcoal jacket, the silk tie, the crisp white shirt. All of it went, folded with the reflexive neatness of a man who had learned young that his appearance was never entirely his own, into the leather messenger bag slung across his chest. In their place, he pulled on a faded gray hoodie, the words of his old law school cracked and peeling across the front, a relic of the place that had made him, dark sweatpants, A black knit cap tugged low against a wind coming in off the river like a blade. He looked nothing at all like the man who had run a federal courtroom 4 hours earlier. He looked like an ordinary, tired man trying to get home. That was the whole trouble. Though he did not know it yet. In this city, on this corner, on this kind of freezing night, an ordinary tired man and a suspect were the exact same sentence. And which one you turned out to be depended entirely on who was looking at you. And on what that person had already decided about men who looked like you. The 9 bus stop sat at the corner of Halstead and Vine. On the seam, where a gentrifying neighborhood ground up against the older, poorer blocks, it was slowly eating. New condominiums glowed gold on one side of the street, their lobbies warm and bright. A shuttered laundromat and a check-cashing place sat dark on the other. Half the streetlights worked, and the ones that did buzzed and flickered, throwing shadows that stretched and snapped back across a skin of gray ice. The transit app on his phone promised the 9 at 9:14. 11 minutes out. Desmond pushed his hands deep into the hoodie pocket, rocked from heel to keep the blood moving, and watched his breath fog and vanish. Fog and vanish. 28 degrees. His ears ached. He thought about the commissioner's face when the last document came in. And then he thought about nothing at all. And he waited. He did not know that 3 blocks north, a man was already deciding who he was. Officer Bryce Halloran was nursing a cold coffee and a colder mood. He was 13 years on the city police force, assigned to the 9th District. And 13 years was exactly how long he had been a patrolman. His career had stalled at the rank the way a car stalls at a light and never moves again. And everyone but Halloran seemed to understand why. There was a file, and it was thick. 42 citizen complaints across the years. Excessive force. Unlawful search. Discourtesy. A soft little word that in the department's internal grammar meant he made me feel like a criminal on my own street. 39 of those 42 complaints had been filed by residents who were black, or brown, or poor, or all 3 at once. And the disposition written on every single one of them was the same word. Unfounded. 0 disciplinary actions. Not one. A perfect record. If you never read past the last column, Halloran did not think of himself as a bad man. And this is the part people never understand. And the part that matters most, he thought of himself as the only thing standing between the good people of this city and the ones who would take everything from them if a man like him ever blinked. He had a line he liked to use. In the locker room, after a few beers. When someone asked how he had done this job as long as he had, "I'm the line," he would say, "between order and the animals. Somebody's got to be the line." That night, dispatch had him working a string of home burglaries. 6 break-ins over 3 weeks in the pricey blocks up the hill, and a lieutenant riding him hard for an arrest. The suspect description was the kind of description that isn't really one, the kind that is really just permission. Male. Black. Approximately 6'1" to 6'3". Dark winter clothing. In a city of 500,000 people. On a night when the temperature sat at 28 degrees and every man alive was wrapped in something dark and warm. That description fit half the men on the street. It was a net so wide it wasn't fishing at all. It was a license. And it invited the laziest, oldest kind of policing there is. Find someone who fits the color. And make the night make sense. Halloran was not looking for nuance. He was looking for an arrest to get his lieutenant off his neck. He turned his cruiser onto the avenue. And the block was empty, except for the wind and one solitary figure standing under the buzzing light of a bus shelter. His eyes narrowed. He eased off the gas, and the heavy tires crackled over frozen slush. He looked, and he saw exactly what he had already decided he was going to see. A black man. Tall, dark hoodie, Knitcap pulled low, hands hidden in his pockets, standing in the shadows on a corner where a man like that, in Halloran's mind, had no business standing at all. To Desmond, the approaching headlights were just another car. Then the car stopped moving like a car, and a spotlight, high and white and brutal, hit him square in the face. He squinted and lifted a gloved hand to shield his eyes. It was a police interceptor, its engine idling low and mean, and he felt that idle vibrating up through the frozen ground and into the soles of his shoes before he ever saw the light bar. He felt a small, tired flicker of annoyance. But he did not feel fear. Why would he? He had spent 20 years as an officer of the court. He assumed it was a routine check. A cop going to ask if he had seen anyone. Tell him to move along. Do the theater. And drive off. The driver's door swung open. Boots came down on the asphalt. One, and then the other. Heavy and deliberate. The sound carrying flat across the empty street. Then the uniform. Then the man. Get your hands out where I can see them. Halloran barked, closing the distance. One hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. Slowly, Desmond drew his hands out of his pockets. Palms open, fingers spread wide. Empty. He narrated it before he did it. The way his father had taught him the summer he turned 15. In a voice that was calm, precisely because it had practiced being calm for 30 years. I am taking my hands out of my pockets now, he said. They are empty. And he stepped forward into the hard, white glare. This was not fear. People who have never had to do it think that it is fear. It is a protocol. It is a survival dance whose steps you learn young and never forget. And every single motion is announced out loud, so that a frightened man with a gun is never once surprised by anything you do. Desmond performed it flawlessly, and it did not matter at all. Officer, he said, level and measured and entirely, without the panic that Halloran was used to hearing. I am waiting for the 9 bus. It is supposed to come at 9:14. Is there a problem? I'll ask the questions. Halloran snapped. What are you doing out here? My car broke down downtown. I'm waiting for the bus. And then, because it was his life's work, and because it was the only thing he knew how to do when a badge held him in place, he laid the legal baseline down, gently, on the record, in the calmest voice he owned. Officer, he said, before I reach into my bag for identification, could you tell me what reasonable suspicion you have to detain me? Am I suspected of a crime? The question hung in the freezing air. Plain and reasonable. To Desmond. It was routine. It was, quite literally, the question that the Constitution existed to let him ask. But to Officer Bryce Halloran, it was the single most unforgivable thing that a man on a street corner could possibly do. In Halloran's world, people on the street did not say the words reasonable suspicion. When they did, they were troublemakers, or lawyers, or worse, ordinary men who thought they were something more than what he had already decided they were. And there was nothing on this earth he despised like a man on his corner who would not be small. And that was the moment the night came apart. Shut your mouth and get on the ground. Boy, before I put a bullet in your head, he screamed it. And in the same breath, he swept his arm forward and hurled the messenger bag across the pavement. And the folded suit and the court documents went scattering into the wind. You don't talk to me. He spat. A piece of trash like you doesn't belong in this neighborhood. His face twisted. And he drove forward in one violent burst and slammed Desmond's spine against the concrete wall of the shelter. Hard enough to knock the breath clean out of him. He jabbed a finger into Desmond's face, spit flying off his lips, and he laughed. A cruel and mocking bark of a laugh. the laugh of a man who has said something he finds obvious and a little funny, and cannot imagine the world will ever ask him to account for. Then he wrenched Desmond's arms back and ratcheted the cuffs down so tight the steel bit through to the flesh, until blood welled up dark around both wrists. And with a final, vicious shove, he threw his whole weight forward and sent the handcuffed man crashing face first down onto the frozen, gravel-strewn concrete. Desmond's cheek split against the ice, and as he lay there, bleeding, the officer leaned down over him and spat on the cracked blue transit card that had fallen from the bag. "Look at you," he said. "Just another nameless piece of garbage bleeding out on my street. Right where you belong. Understand what a body camera is? And understand what it wasn't doing. It was not recording." 30 seconds before he ever stepped out of that cruiser, Bryce Halloran had reached down and held the power button of his camera for 3 full seconds, until the little unit went dark, because some animal part of him already knew what he intended to do and did not want a record of it. There was no footage. That was the whole point of a dark corner with no witnesses. That was why men like Halloran did this kind of thing exactly here. Exactly like this. 3 people stood within 15 steps. A doorman in the warm gold lobby of the new condos looked out through the glass, saw a police stop, and turned back to his desk. A woman walking a small dog slowed on the far sidewalk, took it in, and kept walking. A man buttoned his coat higher and looked down at his phone. Not one of them turned around. That is the mechanism nobody likes to name. The laugh and the looking away turn an act of brutality into a thing that is happening to somebody else. Somebody who must have done something. Somebody whose business it isn't. The crowd does not have to cheer. It only has to fail to turn around. And down on the ice, with the blood at his wrists and his cheek torn open and a knee in his back, Desmond Ward did the only thing left that he could still control. He did not scream. He did not beg. He filed. His mind, even then, became a steel trap, and it began building a federal civil rights case one fact at a time. 9:03 in the evening, the corner of Halsted and Vine, badge number 1174, Unit 9, Atom 6. The exact words, in the exact order, the smell of stale coffee and peppermint gum. He laughed. He said, "I don't belong here." He said, "Garbage." Desmond filed every piece of it. Cleanly. In order. Load-bearing. And he did not yet know what he was building. But he knew, the way you know weather, that it would be very large, and here is the choice he made. Lying on that ice, that he would be asked about again and again in the weeks to come. He could have ended all of it in 10 words. "I am a federal prosecutor. My credentials are in that bag." He could have made himself, suddenly and magically, a person worth treating like a human being. He did not say it. Later, a colleague would ask him why, and he would give the only answer he had. "If I have to announce my title to be treated like a citizen," he said, "then the system is already broken. And the man who is standing on that corner tomorrow night will not have a title." My silence was the evidence. At 9:14 exactly. On time for once in its entire life. The 9 bus pulled up to Halsted and Vine, its headlights sweeping an empty shelter. Because by then, Halloran had already dragged Desmond into the back of his cruiser and driven off. The bus's forward-facing camera recorded 30 seconds of nothing but a scattered bag, loose paper skidding across the ice, and one small blue card cracked against the curb. The driver's name was Marcus Bell, and he had driven that route for 22 years. And he slowed, and he frowned at the abandoned bag and the paper in the wind and the taillights of a cruiser pulling away. And something about all of it landed wrong in him. He did not stop, because you have a schedule and a radio and a supervisor, but he noted the time, the way careful. Ordinary people note the small wrong things they cannot quite explain. That instinct, a bus driver's stubborn, unpaid sense that something here was not right, would matter more in the end than everything Desmond Ward knew about the law. And 30 feet back, in the passenger seat of the second unit that had rolled up to back Halloran, a 24-year-old officer named Tamsin Cole watched a man who had done nothing get beaten and cuffed and thrown onto the ice, and felt the whole thing land cold and sick in her chest, and said absolutely nothing at all. She was 6 weeks out of the academy. She looked at the blood and the frozen card and the man's face, which even now was not full of rage, but full of something worse, something patient and terrible. And she looked at Bryce Halloran, who was her training officer's friend, and had been on the job since before she could drive a car. She felt the whole crushing weight of what it would cost her to open her mouth, and she closed it instead. She would remember that silence for a very long time. Everyone who watches and says nothing always does. They took Desmond Ward, bleeding from the wrist and the cheek, to the 9th District Station House and stood him at the booking desk, where a heavy-set veteran named Sergeant Frank Doyle looked up from his terminal with the flat boredom of a man who had booked 10,000 people and expected the 10,001st to be exactly like the rest. "Name," Doyle said, not looking up. "Desmond Ward." Halloran was already talking over him, already laying the track the way cops do, before anyone can look too closely at where it's going. "Fits the description on the Marlow Hill burglaries," he said. "Resisted. Got mouthy. Obstruction. Real lawyer type." Doyle typed the name into the system to pull a record, and the machine spoke. It did not beep dramatically or flash red like something in a film. It did something quieter. And if you knew how to read it, far worse. The record came back locked. A flat gray banner stretched across the top of the screen. "Restricted personnel record. Federal. Elevated credential required. This query has been logged." Doyle stopped typing. He read it twice. He was a booking sergeant with 26 years behind that desk, and he had seen a great many things come back on that screen. Warrants and holds and gang flags and the whole grim catalog. And he had never once seen that. He did not fully understand what it meant. But he understood, with the animal instinct of a man deep inside a bureaucracy, that it meant this is above you. And something has already gone very wrong. His face changed before Desmond said a single word. "What's in his property?" Doyle asked slowly. They emptied the bag onto the counter. A phone. Case. A charging cable. The folded charcoal jacket. Wrinkled now. Dusted with grit from the pavement. The silk tie. And a slim leather wallet. Doyle opened it. And this is the whole architecture of the moment. So hear it clearly. The truth did not come out of the beat, and it did not come from the officer. It came from a third man, standing off to the side. A man with no stake in any of it, holding a wallet up to the fluorescent light and reading it out in a voice gone suddenly hollow. Behind a clear plastic window sat a credential, a photograph, a heavy embossed federal seal, and a title, United States Department of Justice. Deputy Chief. Public Corruption and Civil Rights Section. Frank Doyle went white to the lips. He looked up at Halloran, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and very careful. The voice of a man who can hear a building beginning to come down. "Bryce," he said, "tell me you did not put hands on him." And Halloran laughed. He actually laughed. The same short, ugly bark from the corner. The reflex of a man who had never once in his life been wrong in a way that stuck. "Come on, Frank," he said. "You believe that guy's got a fake in his wallet. You can order those online. Probably lifted it off somebody. He fits the description. He fits the description. Even now, even with the credential in Doyle's hand, under the light, the federal seal staring up at him. And this is the coldest truth in the entire story. So sit with it a moment. Prejudice is not a shortage of information. You cannot fix it by handing over more facts. Halloran had the fact. It was lying right there on the counter. And his instant, automatics, unshakable response was that the fact itself must be fake. Because the only other possibility, that this bleeding black man in a hoodie was exactly who he said he was. And more, and that Halloran had just beaten a federal prosecutor into the ice for asking a lawful question, was not a thing his mind was capable of holding. So he threw the fact away. He would rather invent an identity thief out of thin air than revise one single thing he had already decided about the man on the corner. Desmond said nothing. He stood at that counter with his split cheek and his bleeding wrists, and he watched Bryce Halloran refuse the truth to his face. And he filed that too. He was shown the credential. And he laughed. And he called it a forgery. Doyle set the wallet down like it had turned hot in his hand. "Get those cuffs off him," he said. Now, they took the cuffs off. The skin underneath was pulped and livid. 2 raw red-purple bands wrapped around each wrist. And the cheek was still weeping blood down onto the collar of the law school hoodie. Doyle looked at all of it. And then he did a thing that he was not required to do and would later be very glad he had done. He called for a camera, and he photographed Desmond Ward's wrists, front and back, and the torn cheek, time-stamped, 6 frames, before anyone in that building could think to talk him out of it. Those photographs would end up on a screen in a deposition, and then they would end up on the front page of the newspaper. "Mr. Ward," Doyle said, and the word Mr. landed in the room like a dropped stone. "There's clearly been a terrible mistake here. Let me get this straightened out for you. We can handle this quietly. Internally. Get you to a hospital. Get you home. No need to make it into a no," Desmond said. It was the first word he had spoken since the counter, and it stopped the whole room cold. "You are not going to handle this internally. You are not going to make this quiet. I was assaulted at a public bus stop, without any reasonable suspicion whatsoever, for asking a lawful question, by an officer who told me I do not belong in this neighborhood, who threw my property into the street, who slammed me into a wall and then into the ground, who cuffed me until I bled, and who has now, twice, in front of you, called my federal credential a forgery." He let that sit in the silence. And Doyle, quietly, almost to himself, asked the question that 100 million people would one day hear, because it was exactly the right question, and it had exactly the wrong answer. "So he said, "we're releasing you, cutting you loose." Desmond turned and looked at him. "Sergeant," he said, "are you unarresting me?" The words dropped into the silence and detonated without a sound. Unarresting, as if you could simply reverse it, as if you could take the cuffs off a man's wrists, and take the blood off his face, and take the marks off his skin, and take it out of his memory, and out of the memory of the 3 people who looked away, and make the whole thing not have happened, because it had turned out that he was somebody. As if the only thing that had gone wrong tonight was that they had beaten the wrong black man. "There is no unarresting," Desmond said, very softly. "There is only a record of what you did, and I am going to make certain that the record is complete." He picked his jacket up off the counter, and his phone, and his keys. He did not take the transit card. It was still lying out there on the ice at Halstead and Vine, cracked, with a boot print on it and the officer's spit frozen across its face. forgotten in the dark by everyone, except that everything leaves a record, even a card on the ground, even spit on plastic in the cold. The next morning, the machine did exactly what the machine always does when a man like Halloran breaks something. It closed around him. By 8 o'clock, the incident had been walked up the chain to Captain Lorne Ashby, the commander of the 9th District. The very same Ashby whose flat, neat signature sat at the bottom of every one of Bryce Halloran's 42 closed complaints. Right above the same flat, neat word, unfounded. 42 times across 13 years, Ashby had spent an entire career keeping the 9th District's numbers clean, which is a very different thing from keeping the 9th District clean. And he understood at a single glance that this was a live grenade with the pin already pulled. So he did what he had always done. He made it disappear on paper. Internal Affairs opened a file, and with genuinely impressive speed, it closed most of it. The stop, they found, was consistent with department policy, given the active burglary pattern and the broadcast suspect description. Those were the magic words. Deployed backward. To launder a hunch into a justification after the fact. The use of force was, they wrote, within policy, for a non-compliant subject who physically resisted, non-compliant, resisted, enormous, heavy words, doing enormous, heavy work, for a man who had announced the movement of his own 2 hands out loud before he made it, and Bryce Halloran, asked to give a sworn statement about the encounter, wrote this, and then he signed his name beneath it. During the physical detention, my body-worn camera failed to record. I believe the unit malfunctioned due to the extreme cold. Battery performance is degraded in low temperatures, and I was unable to capture footage of the interaction. He wrote it because he had to write something, and because there was no footage, and everyone knew there was no footage. So he reached for the oldest excuse in the entire modern catalog, the one that gets written 1,000 times a year, in 1,000 cities, and almost always works. Because who on earth can prove that a camera did not simply die in the cold? The police union closed ranks behind him within the day. The way unions do, because the alternative to defending Halloran was admitting that the file had been 42 complaints deep and nobody had done a single thing about it. And that implicated a very great many people who were not named Bryce Halloran. The union put out a statement about a hard-working officer working an active pattern in dangerous conditions, about the terrible danger of second-guessing split-second decisions from behind a comfortable desk, and about how the officer had, in fact, released the individual just as soon as the situation was clarified. Released as soon as it was clarified. As if that were mercy. As if the entire crime were not the simple fact that it had needed to be clarified at all. By the end of that week, the file was, for every practical purpose, closed. A federal prosecutor had been beaten and wrongfully arrested at a public bus stop, and the enormous system built to hold that officer accountable had examined itself in the mirror, adjusted its own collar, and found itself entirely blameless. And this is the part the story usually skips. And it is the single most important part, because it is the true one. The problem was never only Bryce Halloran. Halloran was one bad officer. But one bad officer with 42 buried complaints is not a bad officer anymore. He is a policy. He is a captain's signature and a union's reflex and an internal affairs unit fluent in the grammar of the word unfounded. He is a machine, and the machine had just proven, cleanly and quickly, that it could grind a man like Desmond Ward all the way down to a closed file and a form letter. If Desmond Ward had been almost anyone else alive, that is exactly where this story would have ended. Desmond retained Yvette Sinclair. If you worked in civil rights litigation in that part of the country, you knew the name, and if you were a city attorney, you knew it the way a sailor knows a particular reef. Sinclair had spent 20 years turning wrongful arrest cases into federal consent decrees, and she took Desmond's case across a conference table in a single meeting because she saw in about 4 minutes exactly what it was. They have already closed the internal affairs file, she told him, sliding it across the table. Within policy, camera malfunctioned in the cold. The union has circled up. Desmond. Ordinarily, this is where a case like this dies. This is the wall. No footage. No witnesses who will talk. A department that has already blessed itself. It is their word against a man they have already labeled non-compliant and resisting. She looked at him across the table. Most people who go through exactly what you went through last night are standing at this exact wall right now. Tonight. And the only difference between you and them is what was in that leather bag. Desmond did understand that. It sat on him like a stone. And here, because this story exists to make you feel a thing, and then to make you honest about the thing you are feeling. A sharp, blunt second-year associate on Sinclair's team, named Priya Raman, said the thing out loud that the whole case turned on. The thing the smooth version of this story never says. Can I ask something that is going to sound wrong? Priya said. We are all sitting in here ready to burn this entire department to the ground for what they did to you. And they should be burned to the ground. But Mr. Ward, if you had been a line cook, or a night janitor, or a 19-year-old with a record and no lawyer, we would not be in this room right now. There would be no case. The blood would be the same. The card on the ground would be the same. The camera would be shut off the exact same way. The only reason there is a case here worth millions of dollars, instead of a closed file and a form letter, is that the man they beat happened to be you. She chose the word carefully. Doesn't that bother you, that the system is about to work perfectly? And the only reason it is going to work at all is that it happened to grab the one man in the entire city who could make it work. The room went quiet. Sinclair did not step in. She wanted to hear the answer too. Desmond Ward was silent for a long moment. And when he finally spoke, he did not defend himself, which is how you knew that it was true. It bothers me more than anything else about this, he said. Yes, if I say my title on that corner, Halloran lets me go, and he apologizes. And then tomorrow night he does the exact same thing to a kid who has no title, no lawyer, and no leather bag. And that kid does not get a case worth millions of dollars. That kid gets a night in a cell and a story that nobody believes. He turned the photograph of his own ruined wrists around on the table so that it faced her. So no, he said. I am not going to stand here and pretend that this is justice. This is not justice. Justice would be that it does not matter at all who was standing on the corner. This is leverage. I happen to have some, and I have exactly one honest thing that I can do with it. I can refuse to let them buy my silence quietly. I can refuse the closed door and the sealed settlement, and I can make every ugly fact of this public, out in the open, so that it costs them something real, so that it becomes a warning, so that the next man on that corner is protected, not because he is important, but because the last time they did this, it very nearly ended a police department. Nobody answered him. Priya nodded slowly. That was the point. There is no clean answer. The question does not resolve. It simply sits there, at the dead center of everything, being true. All right, Sinclair said at last, quietly. Then we do this in daylight. We file. And we subpoena everything. Here is where it should have been over. And for 11 days, it truly looked as though it was. The city moved to have the case dismissed. That closed internal affairs finding. Within policy, camera malfunctioned, was Exhibit A of their defense. A clean bureaucratic verdict from the department's very own oversight body. The union filed its briefs. A cold, competent city attorney named Grant Whitfield took the position that would have worked against almost anyone alive. No footage existed. The stop was supported by an active pattern and a matching description. The plaintiff had physically resisted and had been promptly released. And any injuries were the ordinary and lawful consequence of restraining a subject who would not comply. He did not almost win that argument because he was right. He almost won it because the system was already agreeing with him. The file existed. The disposition existed. The department had investigated itself and cleared itself. And courts give real weight to that. And juries are told about it. And the whole apparatus was lined up on Halloran's side, 42 closed complaints deep, humming along exactly as it had been designed to hum. Sinclair called Desmond on the 11th night. "I want to be straight with you," she said. "They did not beat us on the facts. They beat us on the machine. Halloran is not winning because the evidence is on his side. He is winning. For now. Because he has a captain who buries files. And a union that circles up. And an internal affairs unit that speaks fluent nothing. The very thing that is supposed to hold him accountable is the thing that is protecting him. That is the wall. Desmond, that is the real wall. And most people never, ever get over it. That was the low point. Not a beating. Not a gun. A form letter. And a closed file. And the slow, grinding realization that the entire apparatus of accountability had quietly become the machinery of the cover-up, and that being right was not going to be nearly enough. And then the subpoenas came back, because a cover-up is not a passive thing. It is not merely failing to do the right thing. It is an action. A whole series of deliberate, affirmative choices to conceal. And every single one of those choices leaves its own fingerprints. And some of those choices are not just wrong. Some of them are federal crimes. Bryce Halloran had not simply failed to record, and Bryce Halloran had not simply given a sloppy statement. He had built, with his own two hands, the weapon that was going to destroy him. And then he had signed his name to it, 90 days after a bus that he never caught. Desmond Ward sat at the end of a long mahogany table, in a conference room high above the harbor, in a suit that fit him again. With the last of the bruising finally faded from his cheek, Yvette Sinclair sat beside him, and across the table sat Bryce Halloran, the union's lawyer, and the city attorney, Grant Whitfield. It was a deposition, and Halloran was under oath. He did not look like a man who was worried. He had been cleared once already. He had 13 years of never once being wrong in a way that stuck. He answered the early questions with the flat contempt of a man who fully believed he was. Once again, "I'm going to walk out of this room having lost absolutely nothing." Sinclair let him get comfortable. And then she opened the first folder. The whole thing took a little under 30 minutes. The first machine was the radio. "Officer Halloran," she said, "you detained Mr. Ward because he matched the description of a suspect in the Marlow Hill burglary pattern. Is that correct?" "That's correct. You believe there was an active burglary suspect at large in that area at the time you stopped him." "That's correct." Sinclair slid a document across the table. "This is a certified transcript of 9th District dispatch traffic for that entire evening, subpoenaed directly from the city's emergency communications center." She let him look at it. "At 8:55 that evening, 8 minutes before you stopped Mr. Ward, units responding to Marlow Hill took an actual burglary suspect into custody. Inside a residence, 2 miles from that bus stop, the pattern suspect, in custody at 8:55 and at 8:56, on that very same channel. A unit came over the air and confirmed the apprehension and advised all responding units that the Marlow Hill subject was in custody. Do you know who acknowledged that transmission?" "Officer Halloran." "Silence." "You did," she said. and she played it. A phone sat on the table, and there was a scratch of radio static. And then, unmistakably, Halloran's own voice. 13 years of it. Ninadam 6. Copy. Subject in custody. You acknowledged. On the radio. At 8:56 that evening. That the burglary suspect had already been arrested. 7 minutes before you put a spotlight on Mr. Ward for matching that suspect's description. She closed the folder. There was no suspect at large. You knew it. You told dispatch that you knew it. And then you stopped a man at a bus stop. And you told him he fit the description of somebody who was, at that exact moment, already sitting in the back of another officer's car. There had been no reasonable suspicion. Not weak suspicion. Nona. It had not merely been thin. It had been a lie. And the lie was on tape. In Halloran's own voice. The second machine was the bus. Whitfield tried to move things along. Sinclair did not let him. Let's talk about what you actually did. Officer Halloran. In your view, nobody at all saw this stop. Empty corner. Dark. Bad lighting. No cameras. No witnesses. There were no witnesses. Halloran said. And he very nearly smiled when he said it. Because that had always been the entire point. Hadn't it? You did this kind of thing on the dark corner precisely because there were no witnesses. Your body camera did not record. It malfunctioned. The cold, so there is no footage of the stop. No. Sinclair opened the second folder. The Regional Transit Authority operates the 9 bus, she said. The 9 bus was scheduled to arrive at Halstead and Vine at 9:14. The exact bus that Mr. Ward told you? Repeatedly. He was waiting for. Every bus in that fleet is equipped with a forward-facing camera that records continuously. She slid a still frame across the table. This is from the forward camera of the 9:14 bus. It shows the corner of Halstead and Vine that evening. By 9:14, you and Mr. Ward were already gone. You had driven him to the station. So the bus camera does not show the assault itself. It shows the corner 30 seconds afterward. It shows a leather messenger bag on the ground, where you threw it. It shows court documents scattered across the ice. And it shows a small blue card. A transit fare card. Cracked. Lying against the curb. Exactly where it landed when you knocked it out of Mr. Ward's hands. She laid down a second document. And this, she said, is the tap history for that fare card. Subpoenaed from the Transit Authority and cross-referenced to Mr. Ward's account. It shows the card entering the transit system downtown at 8:41 that evening. It shows Mr. Ward's actual, documented, time-stamped movement from the courthouse district to that corner. A man does not tap into the transit system and travel across an entire city to stand at a bus stop in order to commit a residential burglary 2 miles away that has already been solved. This card, Officer Halloran, this piece of blue plastic that you ground under your boot because it was garbage to you, is a complete, time-stamped record proving that the man you assaulted was doing exactly livin'. Precisely. What he told you he was doing. Waiting. For the bus. And then she set down one more page. And her voice went very flat. We also submitted that card to the forensic laboratory. She said, there is biological material on the face of it. Saliva. The lab developed a profile. It is a match to you. You leaned down over a bleeding man and you spat on his transit card. And in doing so, you left your own DNA at the scene of an assault. You swore under oath you had no involvement in, beyond a lawful, hands-off detention. You did not just fail to record the truth. Officer, you physically deposited the proof of your own contempt onto the evidence. The union lawyer had gone the color of paper. The third machine was the button. And now, Sinclair slowed all the way down. because the last one was not a civil rights violation. The last one was the one that was going to end his life. As he knew it, let's go back to your body camera. Officer Halloran, you told Internal Affairs, under oath, in a signed statement, that during the physical detention, your body-worn camera failed to record, that you believe the unit malfunctioned due to the extreme cold, that battery performance is degraded in low temperatures. You signed that. Correct. That is what happened, Halloran said. And for the very first time, there was something new underneath his voice. A small tremor. Technology fails. It was cold. Desmond Ward, who had sat silent and perfectly still for the entire deposition, shifted slightly in his chair and leaned forward and looked at Bryce Halloran directly, for the first time, and the contempt in that look was so complete and so quiet that Halloran physically drew back in his seat. Sinclair opened the last folder. Your department uses body cameras built by a single manufacturer, she said. Every one of those cameras writes an internal event log, a continuous, tamper-evident record of everything the unit does, stored separately from the video itself, on the device and in the cloud, time-stamped down to the second. We subpoenaed that log, not from your department, from the manufacturer directly. She set it down in front of him, and she read from it in a flat, terrible voice, one line at a time. According to the manufacturer's own tamper-evident audit, your camera did not experience a battery failure that night. The battery level at the relevant time was 61%. The camera did not lose power due to the cold. The internal temperature reading was well within operating range. The camera did exactly one thing at 9:02 and 48 seconds that evening. She looked up. It was manually powered down. The power button was pressed and held for 3 full seconds until the unit disengaged. Not a failure, not a dead battery, not the cold. A thumb on a button held down for 3 seconds. The room had stopped breathing, and here is the timestamp. Officer Halloran, that I want you to sit with. The camera was manually switched off at 9:02 and 48 seconds. According to dispatch, you stepped out of your cruiser to make contact with Mr. Ward at 9:03 and 18 seconds. She let the numbers land in the silence. You turned it off 30 seconds before you got out of the car. Somebody made a sound. A small, involuntary intake of breath. It was the union's own lawyer, watching a wall come down on top of his client. You did not forget to turn it on, Sinclair said. You turned it off. On purpose. 30 seconds before you walked up to that man. You held the button down for 3 seconds, and you shut off the one thing in the entire world that could show what you were about to do. Because you knew exactly what you were about to do, and you did not want a record of it. It was no longer only a civil rights case. Manually disabling a body camera in order to conceal misconduct, and then swearing under oath, in a signed official statement, that it had merely malfunctioned, is the destruction of evidence, and it is obstruction of justice. It is a federal crime, layered on top of the deprivation of Desmond Ward's constitutional rights under color of law. A charge that carries far heavier weight when the victim is left with bodily injury. And the man across that table had left a federal prosecutor bleeding on the ice. You just didn't count, Sinclair said, closing the folder for the last time. On a bus that ran on time. And a fare card you thought was garbage. And a laboratory that could read your own spit. And a manufacturer's log you did not know existed. There was no reason. This is what you did. And you knew. 3 machines. The cleanest, coldest structure the law has. Grant Whitfield, the city attorney, had not said a single word in 10 minutes. He was staring down into the mahogany of the table as though he could read, in the grain of the wood, the exact dollar figure that this was going to cost and Captain Lorne Ashby was not in the room. But when the deposition transcript reached his desk that same afternoon, when he read the 3-second button, and the radio call in Halloran's own voice, and the DNA on the card, Ashby, who had signed the word unfounded 42 times to protect the numbers of the 9th District, took approximately 60 seconds to decide that Bryce Halloran was, and had always been, a rogue officer, acting entirely on his own, unknown to and unsupported by his command. He said exactly that, in writing, before the day was out, expressing his shock and his deep disappointment at Officer Halloran's conduct, his full confidence in the disciplinary process, and his personal, unwavering commitment to accountability. He threw 13 years of his own signatures overboard without so much as a flicker, because the brotherhood that Halloran had believed he belonged to had never once been a brotherhood at all. It was a mutual protection arrangement, held together by shared guilt, and the very instant that the guilt threatened to become Ashby's guilt, the arrangement dissolved. 60 seconds. That is exactly how long that kind of loyalty lasts. And Bryce Halloran, with the deposition over, walked out to the parking lot of the very same station house, got into his own personal truck, a 10-year-old pickup, his own, not the cruiser, and he sat down behind the wheel, and he did not start it. He sat there, in the cold, in the dark, with his hands on the wheel, for 11 minutes. He did not rage. He did not weep. He did not call a single soul. He just sat and stared through the windshield at the brick wall of the 9th District as the entire shape of his life quietly rearranged itself around him. The career, the pension, the line he had believed all these years that he was, the animals he had believed he was holding back. 11 minutes. With the engine off, and then he started the truck, and he drove away. And he was, though he did not yet know the exact hour of it, already finished. 2 weeks after that deposition, the mayor of the city personally requested an emergency mediation. The math was no longer complicated for anyone. If Sinclair took this in front of a federal jury, with the radio call, and the tap history, and the DNA on the card, and the bus footage, and above all, the manufacturer's log showing a 3-second manual shutdown 30 seconds before contact, followed by a sworn statement calling it a malfunction, and the photographs of a federal prosecutor bleeding on the ice, the damages would not be $5 million. A jury would award far more than that, out of sheer, incandescent fury. And then the whole thing would live on the internet forever. And then the United States Department of Justice would come. And the city would lose control of its own police force for a decade. The mediation was held in a neutral, expensive arbitration suite that looked out over the harbor. The mayor sat on one side of the table, with the chief of police, and the city attorney, Desmond Ward, and Yvette Sinclair sat on the other. The mayor looked exhausted, and she did not try to pretend that it was anything other than what it was. Mr. Ward, Ms. Sinclair, she said, the city is prepared to acknowledge that what happened to you was wrong. It was a disgrace, and we are ashamed of it. We want to make this right, and we want to move forward. She slid a term sheet across the table. We are prepared to offer a settlement of $1.5 million, tax-free, subject to a standard confidentiality agreement. We would very much like to resolve this. $1.5 million. And a non-disclosure agreement. That was the number that was supposed to make it all go away. Generous. On paper. Quiet. In reality, a payment large enough to satisfy any reasonable man, in exchange for one signature. A signature that would seal the record and close the file. and protect the department's good name, and ensure that the next time a man asked, "Am I free to leave on a dark and freezing corner?" there would be nothing at all, on any shelf, anywhere, to warn him what was coming. Yvette Sinclair did not even glance at her notes. She looked at Desmond, and for the first time in that entire mediation, Desmond Ward spoke. "Mayor," he said, in the flat, unhurried voice that had ended 100 careers. "Let me explain the reality of your situation, because I do not think your city attorney has been able to bring himself to." He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. And that was the terrible thing about it. "You are not buying my silence," he said. "You are not sealing this. There will be no confidentiality agreement. I am a sworn officer of the United States Department of Justice, and my duty runs to the law, and not to your municipal budget, and not to your press office. So let me be very clear about what is going to happen, and about what it is going to cost you." He slid a single sheet of paper back across the table. "These are my terms," he said. "They are not an opening position. There is no negotiation." The city attorney picked it up, and his eyes moved down the page, and they widened. "First," Desmond said, "the figure is $4.7 million, not $1 less, and you will find that the number is not arbitrary. It is what a case with a manufacturer's tamper log, and forensic evidence, and a false sworn statement, and photographs of an injured federal prosecutor is worth in front of a jury, discounted only by the time and the cost of getting there, which I am fully prepared to spend, and which you are not time." Second, Officer Bryce Halloran is terminated immediately for cause, with a formal finding of misconduct that severs any and all claim to a municipal pension. He does not resign quietly. He does not retire with his benefits intact. He is fired, on the record, for exactly what he did. Third, Captain Lorne Ashby and the shift supervisor are both separated from this department for failure to supervise and for the systematic mishandling of citizen complaints, 42 of them, 39 filed by residents of color, every single one of them closed as unfounded, under Captain Ashby's own signature. That pattern is not an accident, and it does not get to keep its pension either. The chief of police shifted in his seat. "Mr. Ward," he said, "we cannot simply dictate." "Chief," Desmond said, and he cut him off without any heat at all. "I strongly suggest that you figure out how, because if you do not, then my fourth term takes effect automatically." He let it sit there in the silence. "I will forward the complete, unredacted discovery file from this case. The radio call, the tap history, the forensic report, the bus footage, the manufacturer's tamper log, the 42 closed complaints, and Officer Halloran's false sworn statement, directly to the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, and I will personally see to it that they open a pattern or practice investigation into the 9th District. They will examine every stop, every use of force, and every buried complaint going back years. And when they are finished, they will place your entire department under a federal consent decree. A federal judge and a court-appointed monitor will dictate your hiring, and your firing, and your training, and your discipline, and a meaningful portion of your budget. For the next 10 years, or longer, you will not run your own police force. A court will run it for you. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. A federal consent decree is the single phrase that drains the blood out of a mayor's face, because it means the loss of control itself, years of compliance audits, tens of millions of dollars in monitoring costs, and the permanent public admission that a city could not be trusted to police itself. Desmond Ward was not holding a settlement demand across that table. He was holding the one thing that a city government fears more than any dollar figure on earth. He was holding the end of its own autonomy. $4.7 million. The mayor said quietly, staring down at the paper. Mr. Ward, that is nearly our entire discretionary reserve for the year. Then, next year. Major, Desmond said, I would suggest that you spend your discretionary reserve teaching your officers the Fourth Amendment. It is a great deal cheaper. The silence stretched on for a very long time. And then the mayor uncapped a pen. And she signed. It was over. There would be no sealed file. There would be no quiet number. There would be no version of any of this that the next man on the corner would never get to hear about. The fallout was swift. And it was merciless. And it was public. Because public had been the entire point from the very beginning. Within 48 hours, the city announced the settlement, $4.7 million, with no confidentiality agreement, and the terms released in full. Every document. The radio call went out on the local news, and then it went everywhere. And the photographs of Desmond Ward's ruined wrists and his torn cheek. The frames that Sergeant Frank Doyle had taken at the booking desk because something inside him simply could not take them, ran on the front page of the newspaper. Above the fold, Bryce Halloran was publicly terminated for cause, and his pension was severed. And 9 days after that, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against him for the deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in bodily injury, and for obstruction of justice, and for tampering with evidence, and for making a false official statement, all of it arising from the assault, and the manual disabling of his body camera, and the sworn lie that followed, facing the manufacturer's own tamper-evident log, and the forensic report, and his own voice on the dispatch tape. He would eventually plead guilty rather than put any of it in front of a jury, and he would be sentenced to a term in a federal correctional institution. And he would lose, in the end, every single thing that he had built the weapon to protect: the badge, the pension, and, for a long stretch of years, his freedom. The man who had spent 13 years insisting that he was the line had drawn it. At last, all the way around himself, Captain Ashby and the shift supervisor quietly submitted their retirement papers and vanished into the private sector fog. Their reputations permanently welded to a column of 42 closed complaints that anybody now could read. And the 9th District Precinct was gutted, and it was rebuilt, and it was placed under exactly the kind of federal oversight that the hook of this story promised you at the very beginning. Its command structure was replaced. Its every practice was audited. Its new leadership, having watched with their own eyes what a single subpoena and a single bus and a single fare card had done to the last regime, was terrified of that oversight in the specific, highly motivating way that produces real reform where 1,000 speeches never could. And as for the $4.7 million, Desmond Ward had it wired into a trust, and then he gave $2 million of it away to a legal defense fund dedicated to putting serious, well-resourced representation into the hands of exactly the people who never, ever get it. The line cook, the night janitor, the 19-year-old with a record, and no lawyer, and no leather bag, standing at his own dark wall, with nothing on the other side of it. The people who go through precisely what Desmond Ward went through, and who hit the wall, and who find nothing there, because they are not somebody, because no manufacturer's log will ever be subpoenaed on their behalf. He kept the rest. He was not a saint. He was a prosecutor, 6 months after a dead car battery changed the entire course of his life. On a cold and clear Monday morning, Desmond Ward walked back into the federal courthouse, took the elevator up, walked past the assistants, and sat down at his desk. The charcoal suit fit him perfectly. The heavy credential of the Department of Justice sat in his breast pocket, exactly where it belonged. He opened a fresh case file, and he picked up his pen, and he got back to the long work of holding powerful people accountable. Because he was the deputy chief of the Civil Rights Section, and there was, as there always was, a great deal of it left to do. And here is the part that this kind of story almost always forgets to tell you. The federal indictment, the terminated officer, the 2 supervisors forced out, the consent decree hanging over the whole department like weather. None of that was the victory. That was the consequence. Consequences are what a system finally produces when it can no longer avoid producing them. And they are necessary. And they are not the same thing at all as a win. The win was smaller. And it was quieter. And it belonged to people whose names were on none of the paperwork. The win was Marcus Bell, 22 years driving the 9 route, who slowed at an empty corner and saw a bag on the ground and paper in the wind and 2 cruisers pulling away, and felt in his gut that something here was not right, and noted the time. A bus driver's small, stubborn, unpaid instinct that the wrong thing had just happened on his corner. An instinct that put a forward-facing camera and a timestamp into a case that could not have been won without them. His salary did not change. Nobody put his name on the front page. He drove the 9 route the very next morning, exactly as he had driven it the morning before, and the win was Tamsin Cole. Because Cole had stood 30 feet away that night, 6 weeks out of the academy, and watched a man get beaten for nothing, and said nothing. She had failed. That first night, the way that most people fail, out of fear and rank, and the sheer crushing weight of a badge that had been on the job since before she could drive a car, she had looked away. Just like the doorman, just like the woman with the dog, just like the man buttoning his coat, just like the crowd, but she did not stay looked away. Somewhere in those 11 days, when the file was closed and the wall was up, and it looked as though the machine had already won, it was a rookie officer, one of Halloran's own, from the inside, with everything in the world to lose and nothing at all to gain, who could not carry the silence one single day longer, who went to Internal Affairs, and then to the Plaintiff's Counsel, and said, quietly, "I was there. I saw the whole stop. His camera was already off when he got out of the car. I watched him turn it off." It was Tamsin Cole who confirmed, from the inside, the very thing that the manufacturer's log proved from the outside. She hesitated on that corner for one long, sick moment, and then, days later, she chose. She handed over the truth, and she took the full cost of handing it over. And that is a very hard cost to pay inside a police department. And she paid it anyway. She got the second chance that a department gives to the ones who fail once, and then choose right. She kept the badge. That was her whole reward. And it was enough. And it was more than the man she reported against would ever, in his life, have given to anyone, not the prosecutor's credential, not the $4.7 million, not the courtroom, a bus driver who kept the footage, and a rookie who told the truth. That is who won. The story of Desmond Ward is a chilling reminder of how quickly power curdles when a man with a badge believes that he is operating in the dark, unwatched, and answerable to no one at all. Bryce Halloran thought that he had found an easy target, a nameless man he could grind into the ice without consequence. On a corner where no one was looking, he learned, in the very hardest way there is, that the record survives, that the bus runs on time, that the card on the ground remembers, that your own spit can testify against you? That accountability can come from the places you least expect it. A manufacturer's log, a transit timestamp, a rookie's conscience, and that the button he held down for 3 seconds was, all along, the single loudest confession in the room. But do not let the ending comfort you too much. That is the thing this story most wants you to understand. And it is the one thing that it absolutely refuses to smooth over for you. This story ends well for exactly one reason. And it is not the Fourth Amendment. And it is not justice. And it is not the good that lives in people. It ends well because Desmond Ward had a badge in his pocket, the man who is standing on that very same corner tomorrow night. The one with no title, and no lawyer, and no leather bag, and no card the system bothered to keep, and no manufacturer's log that anyone will ever subpoena on his behalf. That man asks the exact same question, "Am I free to leave?" in the exact same calm, careful voice that his father taught him, on the exact same dark corner, with his hands open and empty, and his every movement announced out loud, and he does everything right, and the camera goes off with a 3-second press, and no one turns around. What happens to him? This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, or real departments, or real events, is entirely coincidental. It is one story, built to stand in for the 10,000 others that end instead in a closed file and a form letter. The ones where the man on the corner was nobody in particular, and so nobody ever heard. If this story got to you, if it made your jaw tighten and your pulse climb, then do one thing before you scroll away. Tell us in the comments what you would have done. Standing 30 feet back on that corner, would you have been the rookie? Or would you have been the doorman? Share this with the one person you know who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel. Because the next story we tell is about the man who did not have a badge in his pocket, and about just how far a bus driver and a fare card and one honest witness had to go, simply to be believed.